Hello out there. Welcome to the St. Louis Hegelians and the Institutionalization of Democratic Education. This is a paper that we've written. I am Joe. I'll be joined by Dave and Jasmin. We're all from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. An overview here, what's going on, what are we talking about? So we're going to be giving a more complete consideration of Hegel's impact on American educational thought. We are also going to be in the context of post-Civil War US Hegelianism, and we're concerned with a question of how do we provide freedom for citizens in the land of democracy, and specifically how do we implement institutions, public educational institutions, to promote freedom in the land of democracy. So that's going to be our context and where our big main claim is going to be set. And finally, we'll be illustrating commonalities between John Dewey and William Torrey Harris, and to really make the point that Dewey's thought was not as much of a break from the St. Louis Hegelians as is commonly claimed. Here's Dave to get us started.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to take my task to be that of talking a little bit about William Torrey Harris and the St. Louis Hegelians. All right, so William Torrey Harris, he was a Yale grad from Connecticut, and he arrived in St. Louis in 1858. Shortly thereafter, he became a teacher in the public schools, and in that same year, he met Henry Brockmeyer, who convinced him to study Hegel's grand logic. Now, the war intervened, but in 1866, together they founded the St. Louis Philosophical Society with a cadre of other philosophically minded individuals. Here are many of the other prominent participants in the St. Louis movement. Thomas Davidson, I'll mention him later, but he was a lecturer, and primarily for our interests, he was founder of the Glenmore School for the Cultural Sciences in the Adirondacks. We also have Denton Snyder, the historian of the St. Louis School. He was a prolific author and also a promoter and author about the St. Louis movement. We also have Anna Brackett. She was a graduate of Framingham State Normal School, and she becomes principal of the St. Louis Normal School, the teacher training college. And she was the first woman to occupy such a position, but she was also a translator of Hegel and the Hegelian commentator Karl Rosenkranz. In addition, we also have another female, Susan Blow, who was the founder of the first public kindergarten in the United States, also a devotee of Hegel, and of course, Froebel. Now, these four individuals that I just mentioned were all part of the St. Louis public school system. Also with the St. Louis Hegelians was William Howison, who was the only really academically connected individual with the St. Louis Hegelians. He was a prominent personalist. He was a professor at Washington University at the time. He goes on to become the founder of the MIT Philosophy Department and the University of California Philosophy Department, the Berkeley Philosophy Department. And it was actually through him, he also founded the California Philosophical Union, which becomes famous for being the location where William James gives his speech, where William James first enunciates pragmatism as a philosophical movement and attributes that to Charles Saunders Peirce. All right, so those are some other prominent members of the St. Louis School. Now, chiefly amongst their accomplishments, the St. Louis Hegelians established shortly after their founding in 1866, they found the Journal of Speculative Philosophy. It's the first American philosophy journal, or the first journal devoted specifically to professional philosophy in America. And by some accounts, it's the first English-speaking professional philosophy journal. Now, the importance of the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, we contend, really cannot be overestimated. In addition to bringing Hegelian thought to the United States, primarily through translations, or as Conrad Brockmeyer says, the importance of the JSP was to make Hegel speak English. But in addition to that, it served an important function for being the first scholarly outlet for several important American philosophers. You might know that one of Peirce's early philosophical series, it was in 1868, so shortly after the JSP's founding, Peirce had an important series of articles that came out in the JSP. James as well had early articles in the JSP, so did Royce. And for our purposes, Dewey's first 3 or 4 articles came in the JSP. And it's where one of the first instances where Dewey begins to interact with William Torrey Harris, the editor of the JSP. Tell you a little bit more about the St. Louis Hegelians. They latched on to Karl Rosenkranz's understanding of Hegel. Rosenkranz was a center Hegelian, as opposed to both radical and conservative, that is left and right-wing factions of Hegelian thought. He was more of a moderate center Hegelian. And what we mean by that is that Rosenkranz emphasized institutional reform from within. And in particular, Rosenkranz emphasized the importance of education for bringing about institutional reform from within in a society's institutional framework. And so that is why Rosenkranz, not only did he write on Hegel and was a biographer of Hegel, he wrote on Hegelian educational thought. He was important in Germany for educational thought. And Rosenkranz's book on Hegelian educational thought was translated for the Journal of Speculative Philosophy by Anna Brackett, and that was brought out in Harris's book series later on. All right, a little more about William Torrey Harris in particular. In 1868, Harris becomes the superintendent for the St. Louis public school system. And under his leadership, the St. Louis system becomes a national model. It includes a library, includes the normal school that is headed by Anna Brackett. It founds the first public kindergarten that is led by Susan Blow. I mentioned the normal school. It also has a very important school library attached to it. Well, after 12 years of successfully stewarding the St. Louis public schools, Harris takes over. He retires from the St. Louis system, comes back, goes back to his native New England, and takes over the Concord Summer Schools of Philosophy from Bronson Alcott. And this is just sort of continuing on many exchanges between the St. Louis Hegelians, or the Hegelians centered around St. Louis, and the Transcendentalists centered around New England. The St. Louis Philosophical Society had often invited, say, Bronson Alcott and Emerson, but not only that, many participants in the St. Louis School had also participated in the Concord School as well. So it was a nice, fruitful exchange between the Transcendentalists and the St. Louis Hegelians. Well, Bronson Alcott passes, and the Concord School comes into decline, but Thomas Davidson, again mentioned as a St. Louis Hegelian, takes over and founds the Glenmore School of Cultural Thought in the Adirondacks, where Harris is a frequent lecturer, as is Dewey. And in fact, they both purchase summer homes in the vicinity of Glenmore. All right, a little bit more, rushing through this a little bit. Harris publishes a translation of Hegel's Logic in 1890, bringing to fruition a longstanding aspiration of the St. Louis Hegelians. It is a translation of Hegel's Logic that Dewey draws upon for his own lectures on Hegel. And in 1889, after his stint as leader of the Concord School, Harris becomes the US Commissioner of Education in 1889. Now, I'd like you to think about that. Imagine the leading expert on Hegel becoming, in effect, Secretary of Education for the United States. So it would be a pleasant turn from our most immediately past Secretary of Education. Anyway, as part of the U.S. Commissioner of Education, Harris serves on the committees of 10 and 15 and is responsible for articulating standards for teaching and learning, as we'll mention later, responsible for professionalizing the instruction of education. And finally, we are going to contend that Dewey's understanding of Hegel derives, not wholly, but at least in part, from the St. Louis Hegelians. And it's quite different from more conservative, non-theological understandings of Hegel that might have emanated, for instance, from the United Kingdom or other parts of the continent. And finally, as a last testament for Harris's influence on Dewey, Dewey points out that as part of, and I quote, almost the only group of laymen devoted to philosophy for non-theological reasons, Harris's example was so encouraging to Dewey that it was a distinct factor in deciding me, that is Dewey, to try philosophy as a professional career. So I'm going to turn the talk over to Jasmin, and she is going to tell us a little bit about some of the more substantive claims from this slide. Jasmin?
Thank you. So I will be focusing on our view of what was distinctively American and also Hegelian about the St. Louis Hegelians. And so what I'm going to be talking about now is the American paradox of democratic education, as we claim we find it for the first time in St. Louis, with a focus on a move from individualism to institutionalism. So what we're trying to claim in this paper is that the St. Louis Hegelians diverged from their Prussian ancestors in focusing more on the participation in democratic institutions that we would need in the New World. So there was the thought that American values and institutions would have to be aligned in a much more substantial way with the individuals, and that educational institutions would have to bring this alignment about. And so we, on the one hand, in the St. Louis Hegelians find very much American values, such as Emerson's focus on self-reliance and self-trust. So we definitely find features here that we could call transcendentalist. And we also find features that I'm going to talk about a little bit now that we could more qualify as American Hegelian. So we have a coming together, a mix of transcendentalism and Hegelianism here that we don't really have anywhere else up to that point. So one paper that we discussed in our paper is Joshua Goldstein's, in which he claims that Hegel was already trying to reconcile Plato's integrity ideal and Rousseau's collectivist ideal, which much of the Hegel literature would agree with, and namely that Hegel is trying to address the difficulty that on the one hand social life might corrupt us and we need to withdraw into private life in order to find truth, that he's also on board with Rousseau's claim that truth can only be found in the social order. And so Goldstein argues that this paradox is already reconciled in Hegel's, especially philosophy of right, so that Bildung would help us reconcile the paradox. And that therefore we could already understand Hegel as a democratic thinker. What we are arguing in our paper now is that this is actually a move that only happens once Hegelian thought reaches St. Louis. That this is the point where the paradox of education actually becomes a democratic paradox of education. And one passage where this becomes very clear is that we have the claim in the St. Louis Hegelians that Hegel was in important dimensions underdeveloped, and in particular that Hegel needed to be democratized. And this obviously is a reading of Hegel that very much diverges from the received reading of Hegel. And what we're claiming in our paper is that Dewey and Harris very much agree on this divergence from the received reading of Hegel. Namely that they both think that there's an open-endedness in history, and that is something that needs to be characteristic also of what democratic education should look like, that this open-endedness needs to very much figure here. So, and that is why we argue that Dewey and Harris belong into the same category and maybe into a different category from the other Hegelians at the time. They wanted to provide freedom for citizens in a democracy, and they understood that public educational institutions would have to be the tool to reach this goal. So St. Louis was an environment that gave concerns for the positive freedom of individual citizens, and there was also an understanding that the means through which we could accomplish this is through educations, in particular educational institutions. Again, this reflects an interesting fusion that we didn't have before between Hegelianism on the one hand and transcendentalism on the other. So very characteristic American development here. So we have Hegel, and we also have self-reliance and focus on institutions. And one reason the St. Louis Hegelians focused so much on institutions is that they saw that there was a threat of disintegrative individualism to the new country, and that positive freedom of the citizens could only be accomplished through communities that we would need to build and institutions. So both Harris and Dewey saw education as critical in building the new country, in establishing a democracy. And now Scott Johnston claims that there are actually serious pedagogical differences between Harris and Dewey, that Harris and Dewey have different understandings of Hegel, that we have a metaphysical understanding on the one hand versus a transcendental or supernatural one on the other. However, we're trying to argue that these differences are not that important. Namely, Dewey himself already states that Harris and the St. Louis Hegelians had a secular orientation. And we can see that in their discussion of the role of the public schools. So we argue in our paper that ultimately, while Harris and Dewey may have had pedagogical differences, their commonalities still outweigh these differences. American education was supposed to establish a democratic order. They both denounced the priority of science over the humanities, and they both agreed on an anti-empirical epistemology. So that learning in an important sense is a process of making, that knowledge is created. Okay, now I'm going to pass on to Joe, who will tell us about institutional education.
Thank you, Jasmin. So to finish up here, let's look at what this institutional education in the land of democracy looks like. So we see that St. Louis Hegelians gave Hegel's abstract educational philosophy, gave it a concrete form. And this is done by the St. Louis Hegelians and then eventually Dewey. And when we're thinking of St. Louis Hegelians at first, we can see this evident in Harris's differentiation between primary, secondary, and higher education. And elementary, he has this notion of 5 windows of the soul. It's an inventory of sorts. And then secondary goes further, it's a further reflection. And then in higher education, there's a comparative of all the subjects that have already been learned. Dewey was not as set, or is not as wed to a set curriculum, but he did embrace a progression of reflection. Harris also notes that education requires a transition from education by authority to education by insight, and essentially a transition from being told what to do to having, your own sense of what is right to do, but that there has to be a balance, because if education by insight comes too early, you get like sort of too much of an arrogance, a self-conceited, and so that can't come too early. So there has to be a balance. But the point here is that because there has to be a balance, there has to be a method or a strategy in order to teach this balance to come about. Hence the emphasis that we see with the St. Louis Hegelians and Dewey on the education of educators, or pedagogy. We see this sort of pedagogy, or the education of educators, happening around this time. Harris helped raise admissions to admission standards and the graduation rates of normal schools. We might see things like what we would now call best practices, where institutions are training teachers. In a sense, they're now professionalizing the field. And there's examples of this all over the place in the American Hegelians. And just kind of a side note here, it's a Hegelian thought that their rational, meaning their Hegelian rationale, was now real, and their real was now rational, a Hegelian line of thought there. Eventually, we see the academicization of education. We see scholarship on teaching and learning. And again, a Hegelian notion here, where their own professions are now objects of their own study, their self-activity. So teaching is not this alien concept, but it's a self-conscious activity. And then, of course, Dewey is contributing to the academicization of education as well. However, it is the St. Louis Hegelians, like Harris, who made Dewey's work possible. So some concluding thoughts here. Dewey was intertwined with Harris and other American Hegelians, and Dewey did not have a radical break from his Hegelian predecessors, especially with regard to democratic educational institutions. Institutional Hegelianism in the St. Louis public schools was a model of Hegelian democratic education, and this was concrete practice of the many ideas Dewey would later give full philosophical consideration. Dewey is known for focusing on institutions as a means for dealing with problems of education and society, and we're claiming that this was a continuation of his American Hegelian predecessors, and it is because of their efforts that Dewey's work was possible. Thank you for listening to our talk, and we look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much.